Hi, everyone. I am beyond honored to have the privilege to celebrate International Women's Day alongside two influential women moving the dial towards gender equality. Thank you, Nabeela and Esther, for joining me on this monumental day in history. I'm Alicia, and I'll be moderating the panel for today. I'm the founder of the Hope Sisters, which is a nonprofit with the mission of spreading hope and getting more people involved with the art of giving. I'm also a huge technologist, and I believe for the future that we can really leverage AI and technology to solve some of the world's biggest problems. I'm honored to be joined with Nabeela and Esther. Nabeela leads human resources and corporate affairs for one of Canada's largest employers, Walmart, with over 90,000 associates and more than 400 stores nationwide. Nabeela also serves as a board member for the Miracle Foundation, which is a US and India based organization which has the bold ambition to find a loving home for every single orphan child in the world. And I'm also joined here with Esther, who is an educator and teacher. She's a founder of Tract, which is an educational app with the whole goal of having kids teaching kids. She is an author and a mother of also three influential women: Susan Wojcicki, who is the CEO of YouTube, Janet Wojcicki, who is an epidemiologist, and then Anne Wojcicki, who is a founder and CEO of 23andMe, a huge biotech company. Thank you both for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me and for including me in this incredible celebration.
Yes, thank you, Alicia. It's an honor to be here and have this conversation with you.
So I wanted to start off by first asking you both why we're here today. I feel like, we're still having this conversation. It's true that, gender equality is progressing, but we're still not where we want it to be. There's only 38 women CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. 700 women are dying every day due to maternal mortality. And while women are thriving in classrooms, they're not in workspaces. So why are we here today? And why are we not where we want to be?
Well, who wants to start on this very challenging question?
I'm happy to kick us off. I mean, I think, International Women's Day and it is really intended to bring education and awareness to more people. And the fact that we need International Women's Day and Women's History Month is a testament to the fact that we have a lot of work to do to educate and inform both women and men, politicians, individuals, organizations on the work that still needs to be done. I think especially now in the midst of what's happening as a result of COVID, we're actually at the risk of seeing generations of progress around gender equality and gender representation in the workplace eroding before our eyes. So this is definitely a moment in time where we need to not just have this conversation, but double down on this discussion and really evaluate, the systemic issues that we need to address when it comes to allowing for equality in the workplace, but also allowing for equality in society as a whole. So I think that's why, I'm actively participating in this conversation every single day, but especially in this month.
That's a great answer. I agree with everything that Nabeela said, but also you asked the question of why do we keep having to do this?
Mhm.
And I mean, we've been trying to do this for a long time. I'd like to remind everybody that things have improved, and what happens is we forget that things have improved. And so we feel discouraged. But if I think about what was like when I was a little girl, I was not allowed to wear pants. Girls were only allowed to wear skirts.
Hmm.
And that meant not only, at school, but at home, you were not supposed to go out of the house wearing anything but a skirt. So you can imagine how confining that was and how difficult that was. And especially in situations where it might have been really cold outside and you were still stuck wearing a skirt. The other thing is I started as a journalist in the 1970s, beginning of the 1970s. And I could not get into the press club because they banned women. Women were not allowed. So we have made progress because now I can wear pants, right? And I'm accepted as part of the journalism team. I don't have to, pretend that I'm something I'm not. But we still have a long way to go. And the Me Too movement helped a lot of women because we were all facing, I think you both are way too young to know this, but sexual harassment was commonplace, and it was sanctioned. Not only was it sanctioned, men were seen as macho and masculine, if they did this. And so it was encouraged even. So I think we have made progress, but I think it's very hard to change culture. That's part of the reason why it's taking us so long. And we're actually fighting against something that is just very difficult for people to do. So I think we need to double down. As Nabeela was saying, we need to make sure people know what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think we have reached millions of women, but we still have many millions more to go. And as you were saying, there's so many women dying in childbirth today, and it's completely unnecessary. We just don't prioritize it. So that's my answer to see whether we can change. Hopefully we can continue to change.
Well, that's so amazing to hear, and I think definitely we are progressing. I think that double downing on that's really important. And I wanted to hear more from you, Esther, because you grew up in a really patriarchal society. I mean, just how were you able to empower yourself and also your daughters to develop resiliency and enter rooms where you were not really represented?
You're right. It was tough. And there was a tragedy that happened when I was 10 years old. And my youngest brother died as a result of was poor information from a doctor that caused it. But what I realized is that my mother was just afraid to ask a question. She was afraid to contradict the doctor. And, she was an immigrant coming from Russia, and she thought, everything was better in America, and she just didn't understand it. And so, she should never challenge somebody, in position of responsibility like a doctor. So unfortunately, she never asked the question, and she and my brother passed away. But somehow, as a small child, I was 10 at the time, I realized that education was the key to getting out of any kind of a situation like I was in, poverty. We lived we were really impoverished. And so even though I wasn't supposed to be in classes like I remember taking advanced math classes in high school, and I walked in the door of the class. I was a little bit late, and then the teacher said to me, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "Well, I'm taking calculus." And he's like, "Really? You really belong in this class?" And it was all full of boys. I was the only girl, and he was like, "I'm not sure you really belong here." But anyway, he couldn't stop me because I'd already been assigned to the class. But I think a tragedy like my brother, it just gave me the motivation and the power to say, I'm not going to follow what these people say. I am going to think for myself, and I'm going to try to help other people understand the power of education and the power of thinking for yourself. So that's what's motivated me all these years. And that's what continues to motivate me. And that's why I'm here. And that's why I do what I do. And that's why I started Tract, because I felt it was really important for all kids to feel empowered. And most of them don't. Most of, the school system makes you feel like you know nothing and penalize you for the silliest mistakes. So yes, that's what I was hoping to do. And Tract so far seems to be doing what it should be doing. It's very young though. We're only about 4 months old. So we're sort of a baby company. We'll grow.
Well, that's so inspiring to hear, Esther. And I wanted to take it to you, Nabeela. I think that there's no doubt that a male-dominated workspace can be very discouraging. What have your experiences been like, and how did you break the societal norms?
Yes, I would say early on in my career, I was definitely stuck in the stereotype of what leadership looked like, and my reference points were all men. I think being mimicking and echoing some of these masculine tendencies that I saw other men demonstrate was the perception I believed of what leadership could look like. And I'll give you a great example. So I really, early on in my career, I was a manager at a very young age, completely unqualified at the time to be leading people. And as a young female, I'm like early 20s leading other people, it used to bother me a lot when women would cry at work. I mean, it would frustrate me to no end because I was like, no, don't cry. You're doing a disservice to all of us. You're feeding into the stereotype that we can't handle the pressure, that we can't handle the stress. And I know that I shook the confidence of many women that worked for me because I would tell them that, you know, they needed to figure out how to maintain their composure and get their stuff together. And, you know, and I'm sure the way that I reacted as their leader was completely demoralizing to them at the time, right? And how I know that. But that was the perception that I had at the time. I bought into this false belief that we had to be, you know, unemotional and, you know, somewhat rigid and stern, and that was kind of my false perception. I had to go on my own journey of understanding, you know, these false gender stereotypes and improve my own gender intelligence and learn, you know, a lot more than I knew at the time. And I did the same thing for myself. Like I really questioned anytime I felt emotion at work, that's not what it belonged, and I had to just suppress the emotion. Now my team knows me. I'm a huge crier, so I cry. I'm like one sad song away from shedding tears on a good day, and I, you know, don't feel shame or guilt about it because I'm a woman and I, you know, get emotional. And for those that do, that's them, and for those that don't, that's them too. And there's no right or wrong in any of that, either side of that. But I think that's just a really simple example of having to learn what those false narratives are and unlearn some behaviors that I had fallen into myself. And then try to course correct. Like I actually wrote an individual letter to every female that worked for me, like, you know, in the past, apologizing for what I had, you know, told them at the time, and encourage them to cry it out as much as they want if that's their natural tendency, and that there's no shame in that. So I think there's been a lot of those examples of having to fight stereotypes, both as a female, but also as a Muslim. I would walk into rooms being the only female, and, you know, when you have vendors and suppliers, which are predominantly, you know, coming in as senior leaders and predominantly men, they'd scan the room trying to identify, you know, non-verbally who's in charge. And they would direct their energy and their conversation to, you know, who they thought was the person in charge, until they realized it was me. And then you couldn't hide the shock on their face. Like you can't hide the shock when they find out it's me. So I slightly got a little bit of joy in that moment when they all looked and realized that I was the one in charge. I've even had someone literally tell me no. Like I introduced myself as the manager and they said, no, like, but where's the real manager? And I said, no, I'm the manager. And they said, no, but you can't be. So I've had those discussions. I'm like, no, I am. So it's just, you know, those are just constant situations that you encounter, and you just learn to deal with them and not allow them to affect your confidence, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's so common, at least for me, or I feel like many other young girls, that they feel like they have to hide what makes them feminine. They have to suppress their feminine energy. So what advice do you both have for young girls who feel as if they have to suppress their feminine energy just to thrive in classrooms or just to thrive in the workspace?
That's a tough question, because you want to please the people you're working with, and you want to have the biggest impact you can. And so in order to do those things, you somehow have to do things that maybe you didn't want to or weren't planning on doing. It's great if you can be real and be authentic, because authentic is what everybody really wants. They don't want fake. But I know it's a tough road, and it creates problems, just like what I guess for Nabeela, if somebody came in the room and said, oh my God, you're not the leader, I can't believe it. That's pretty intense. But you know, they need to accept the changes. I think what's happening now in the world is that Me Too is really having an impact. It had a big impact in the US. It kind of went overboard. And then it's slowly working its way around the world. And I think as it does, the idea of women holding leadership roles and women not being sexually harassed um, are priorities. And so we just need to, it's just like what you said at the beginning, it's a priority and we just need to keep working with it. And I would say, 30, 40 years from now, things will be much better, but it's not going to happen in overnight, unfortunately.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think Esther's examples give us hope for how much has changed, right? That in another, that so much more can and will change as this conversation continues. I think the discussion around feminine energy is a really interesting one. We can't really have it void of cultural context. And, Esther talked about it's hard to change culture. I would take that, even further and say like, what we're trying to do is alter belief, right? For people's behavior to change, you have to change their belief. And of course, people's beliefs around gender norms and what's feminine and what's masculine is rooted in people's culture and societal norms. And that varies widely, from North America, from the US and Canada to the Nordics, to the Middle East. So that always has to be, we have to have that discussion in that context. Cultural and social intelligence is important. And then I would say, of course, there's stereotypes that we're trying to dispel and myths that we're trying to dispel that society perpetuates, that individuals believe. I talked about one myself, that believing that crying or showing emotion at work was equivalent to being incapable of being able to lead, which obviously is not true. And now what we're seeing is actually, we're seeing some of these, what we consider to generally be, soft skills, which generally, again, I want to talk, generally associated with women being better at these soft skills. We're now seeing them called power skills. Because as we move more into a future that is technology enabled but human led, we're trying to unleash human potential. And we know that psychological safety and authenticity and vulnerability and forgiveness, which are all skills that, again, stereotypically would be associated with women, are actually power skills. And so I think the conversation is changing as well. I would say to young women, and this is not just to young women, but in general, every company has its own culture, and companies want to create a company culture. It's what defines them. But there is a fine line between socializing yourself to that company culture and maintaining your own authenticity and maintaining your own sense of, being. And that's a journey, I think, and a hard line for people to sort out. Because to Esther's point, you want to socialize to the company culture, you want to fit in, you want to be part of this thing that's really, that you've signed up for, but you want to do it in a way that's true and honest and authentic to yourself. And it's a challenging balance to strike, but the individual has a responsibility in that, and I think the organization has a responsibility in that. Organizations have to create the environment where that's possible, and individuals have to do their own work to be able to stand in their own truth and be authentic to themselves in that space. And so I think that's where the two things come together in a really nice, in a really meaningful way. Because as an organization, I can't know your truth and I can't know your authentic self. You need to bring that to the table. And I, as an organization, need to create the space where I can leverage that, and it's okay to be your unique self. So it really is a responsibility on both sides.
Mm-hmm. I agree 100%. It's really important to have that responsibility on both sides.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that, we talked about it's a lot about breaking the stigma I think breaking the stigma, it really comes from breaking it from a young age. And I know that, Esther, you have a lot of experience with educators, but I think how do educators, how can they foster inclusive environments for young women? I know with me, when I was just in grade 8, I would lead my robotics team, and there was a boy who came up to me and who was in my robotics team, and he said, Alicia, why are you even programming or coding when all you're ever going to be is a housewife? I think educators have a huge role to play when it comes to this type of culture and making inclusive environments for young women. So, how do you think educators can make those inclusive environments?
Well, I think that was an incredible example. And I think that's one of the things that educators need to fight against is these stereotypes of what you are going to end up in being.
Mm-hmm.
And So we did a study, an informal study at my high school where I taught, Palo Alto High School. We did it about 15 or 20 years ago. And what the students did is they went and sat in class, and they did it into about 15 different classes. They just sat and watched. The teachers were really very upset. They didn't want to know what the kids were doing. And what they were doing is they were looking at the number of times that teachers called on boys versus girls. And it was 3 to 1. And so we published that story. And the idea was, they weren't doing it on purpose. It was just subconscious. And so what we tried to do is say, you have to consciously make sure you're calling on both girls and boys at the same rate, because you can't empower them as long as they are just sitting there silently. So educators play a huge role, and a huge role in how you conceptualize yourself and your future. And I, as an educator, always wanted to make it really clear that it's a level playing field. Boys and girls can reach the same goals, can do the same things. And I did that for my daughters, and I've done that for my students. And it worked. But I think all teachers need to be on the same page, not just most of us, but all of us. And I think we're headed in that direction, but there's still areas of the world where we're not, and we need to work on it. We can't give up.
Hmm. Definitely. And I wanted to ask you, Nabeela, I think that in the workspace, a huge thing that we talk about is we really want, female supporters, and we have a lot of females talking about Women's Day or advocating for women's rights. But I think it's also so important to champion male allies as well. And I think that, with your passion for diversity and inclusion, I think it's clear that diversity does not always necessarily lead to inclusivity. So, how do we champion male allies to cultivate more inclusive spaces for women?
It's a great question. And I think we need to go back to addressing individuals' core beliefs. And that, again, that goes both for men and women. Because again, I think I was stuck into a stereotype and a gender norm, and I was a female. So I think both women and men are stuck into these stereotypes. Women are socially conditioned to feel unentitled in many areas, or more unentitled than men in many areas of their lives. So that it needs to be addressed in both places. But if I were to zoom in specifically on men, what we're working on at Walmart Canada is this campaign about what's your why. And I think asking both men and women in the business, but lots of our male colleagues, what's your why on gender equality? Like, what if you really ask yourself, talk about root cause analysis, you ask yourself why 5 times, why? What's the core of what's driving you to advocate for, sponsor women, and promote gender equality, gender parity? And a lot of times the first surface question or first surface answer you get is it's related to a male's partner or a male's child, or they get into a relationship, or they have a daughter, and that becomes their why. I challenge that narrative, and I'm like, okay, let's go even deeper, because we all have to be driven by this cause beyond our own family circles or our own individual circumstances to really make a difference. And I think that goes for any large societal change or any social justice issue, that it has to go beyond what's our circle of influence and what's really our own kind of nucleus. And so really having that conversation, having more and more male leaders share their why to encourage and empower other men to do the same, and getting to the root cause of what's driving them to change their belief, which therefore changes their behavior and makes them more aware of how to promote gender equality and gender parity. So that's step one. And then step two is giving tools and resources to men so that they can lead in an inclusive way that creates the flexibility and the support and the sponsorship that a lot of women need to be successful. And having the confidence around how to have those conversations and take those actions is another really important part.
Yeah, I do think I agree with what you said. I think it might be helpful for companies to have inclusive trainings where it just makes them aware of some of the things they might be doing that they're not even aware that they are doing. And I know that there's always these corporate trainings that are taking place for one reason or another. And if we could just have, a few days on inclusion and treating people with, respect and equality and so forth, I think that might make a big difference, because a lot of people, a lot of men, they don't even know they don't realize what they do. It's so instinctual that they are unaware. And I just wonder if they would be aware, would that help them make the change?
Absolutely. I think every organization has a responsibility to educate their population on things like unconscious bias, as an example. I mean, that's become, I think par with the course on any company that's taking diversity, equality, inclusion training, seriously. Unconscious bias is kind of the first order of business. And that's helping to create awareness. I think the other thing is calling it out when you see it, having the confidence and being courageous to call out any behavior that is not conducive to gender equality when you see it, and in a way that also is compassionate and helps people educate themselves. And because we also can't create a culture of fear. That's, again, there's a fine balance between addressing these issues and creating, maintaining psychological safety for people to have the right courageous conversations.
Yeah, I agree.
Mhm.
There has to be a safe place. And also, if you are trying to train people to behave differently, you want to do it in such a way that it isn't punitive. Because right now there's a lot of stuff out there that is punitive, so that it makes people fearful of coming up with suggestions, because they're worried that it's going to hurt their career, hurt them as people. But honestly, if we can just course correct without the punitive part, that will probably help change happen.
Mhm. I think what both of you mentioned, I think it's really about also having men, be authentic and be themselves and be open as well. I think that what's really interesting about all of us is that we're all from three different generations, and I want to ask, do you guys think that there is like a discrepancy in what gender equality looks like for each of our generations?
Oh, huge. I mean, it's just huge what gender equality looked like. My generation, literally. I mean, when I got married, I lost my name. I didn't even have a name anymore. I was Mrs. Stanley Wojcicki, and that's how I was addressed everywhere. Was the way it was, and there were so many things I couldn't do. I couldn't get a credit card in my name. I mean, it feels like the horse and buggy century, right? But it was not that far long ago. I couldn't own a house, get a house in my name. There's a lot of things I could not do. And um, and then everybody in society thought this was the way to go. Men thought it was fine. Women also did too. The women weren't complaining. I think they complained to each other and complained to themselves, but they were afraid to say anything publicly about it. So I think, my generation was much different than what's happening today. And of course, like you say, we're three different generations. So Nabeela, how was it for you?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to hear your examples, Esther, and how much has changed since you're you entered the workforce. I think in my generation of the last 20 years, I've had the pleasure, I think, seeing the tail end of some of that patriarchy in the workplace and starting to see a more progressive dialogue, which Alicia's carrying on the baton of having. And I mean, you could just look at the Me Too movement and the movement that's happened since then. It's really been driven by youth, right? I mean, youth are actually taking a much stronger activist role on these social issues than I think in the past. And so I definitely sense a shift in the conversation. And I think we're starting to see the tip of the iceberg of that effort, in the workplace. I think the challenge is going to be, how to create space for every option. I'll give you a great example. I just spent several years in the Nordics. And, when we're having this conversation, you could say that's a very progressive model of gender equality, and the systemic, support for gender equality is very strong there. But I was actually talking to a woman who said that she was feeling pressure to go back to work after having a child when she wanted to stay home, because the social norm in that country was that because of the support you get for childcare and maternity and paternity leave and everything that's established in society, that it's expected that the woman would go back to work, right? And her and her partner actually didn't want that. She wanted to stay home and be a stay-at-home mom, but she was feeling pressure to go back to work. And so it was a really interesting conversation. I almost like if we fast forwarded 100 years, and we could say that in North America, we had some of the same social support and structure for women, with flexible workplaces, with childcare and maternity paternity leaves that are really much more progressive than we have today. And there's also another extreme to it where then you're feeling a different kind of pressure. So how do we create a future where that's flexibility and support is there, but women still get to choose what is the best option for them, and there's not a social pressure one way or the other in terms of entering the workforce or not entering the workforce. And I think so. I think it's something we need to be cognizant about as this work continues. But of course, there's still a lot of groundwork to lay, and to get to that type of a problem. It's a different problem in a different place, but it was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've heard that before. So it's not just in Scandinavia, but it was also this pressure here that women are educated, they have important positions, they have a child, and then they want to stay home.
Exactly.
The pressure on them to go back to work is just too strong.
Exactly.
Given the freedom to make a choice.
Well, I mean, that's something I've never heard before, so that's really interesting. I think to share a bit about my generation, because I think that I feel like a bit about with my generation, it's obviously we have, I think we've improved so much, but I think there definitely are still the gaps. I know there was an activity Crayola did where it was girls from when they were 6 or 8 years old, they drew themselves and they drew a selfie of themselves and they wrote down what they described themselves as. And there was like confident, I'm pretty, I'm strong. And then they did the same activity when they were about to graduate high school, and it was more of just words like, "I'm scared, I'm discouraged, I'm not capable." And I think that in some ways it is what other people put on you, but it's also the perception you have of yourself, which I think with my generation especially, like that's going to be one of the huge things. We have guys telling us we can't do that, but I think as kids, we never take no for an answer. When someone tells us no, we do it anyways. But the main thing is really the perception that we have of ourselves. But I think that over time, hopefully things will get better.
Yeah, I wanted to share, there's this great research that was done by the Female Leads, Women at Work. And there was a 1994 study, titled Working Women Don't Have Wives. And it was, the set of questions was recently reevaluated. And it helped bring light to some of the current norms that are no longer norms. Like we'll talk about imposter syndrome. Like there's a lot of perception amongst women that imposter syndrome is really, a huge issue for women. This research actually says that's something that's declining. Like more and more women are comfortable in their own confidence. But then there's some really strong, persistent issues that still need to be addressed. And so I just highly recommend, anyone to look it up and read it. It's a great body of work, and it helps compare what women were facing in 1994, right? And when I was starting in the workforce, right, Alicia, and not starting in the workforce, but you still early in my career. And I think Alicia, maybe some of the more persistent issues that your generation is challenged with and facing. So it's a great body of work.
Well, I want to close this off by asking, we are three generations, but how do you guys think we can all work together to dismantle these inequities? And what is like your action items, advice for young girls out there?
Well, first of all, that's a great question again. But first of all, I do think we need to really keep working on it. So some people think, oh, we've already made so much progress, we can just relax now and not worry about it. I think we have to realize that we are not there yet. And not only that, there's many places in the world where women don't enjoy a lot of the same privileges as they
Right.
in Scandinavia or the United States or other parts of the world. So it's awareness. As I said when I first talked, it's awareness and it's cultural. And I think men feel threatened because, women are trying to assume roles that they normally held. And so if they can be reassured in some way that collaboration and teamwork is more effective and will help everyone lead a better life, then I think we're going to be able to make more progress. As long as men feel threatened and think that it's not going to work and that there's problems, then I think we're going to it's going to be harder to achieve. So we need to include men in our struggle. And these men are all our sons, right? And our husbands. So they're people we know. And we just need to make sure that they understand, and worldwide, not just locally. So thanks for asking that question.
Absolutely. I think I'll go back to what we started with, which is this is getting to the core of, to change society and culture, we to get to the core of individual belief, right? And so I think anytime you have this type of big systemic issue, there's always three components to it. It's the individual's responsibility. And I would say for everyone out there, women and men, educate yourself on gender bias, educate yourself on conscious bias, educate yourself on, gender stereotypes, and ask yourself, how are you contributing to those things, and how are you trying to combat them personally. I think also for young girls to do their own work and trying to understand, and that's a lifelong journey. I do that work every day. I think we're all doing that work every day because, we're always work in progress. But how do you show up in your most authentic self? And, how do you also contribute to a positive culture in an organization without losing yourself in that process? So that's the individual component, addressing bias and mindsets and stereotypes and educating ourselves. Then I would say, organizations also need to create the psychological safety, the training, as Esther said, the toolkits to support both men and women in this process in the workplace. I would also like to add, we need to have this conversation in the context of intersectionality, because we know by fact that women of color, it's even harder for them, and there's extra levels of microaggressions that are at play, especially when it comes to women of color. So we need to have this context, we need to have the conversation with the context of intersectionality. And then I would also, talk about, we need as a society, so individual, organization, and as a society, we need to address these systemic issues that are still facing women in North America, and in Canada or the United States when it comes to options for childcare, right? I mean, that is a big one. More flexibility, to onboard and offboard after having a child. That is still a huge challenge for women who are trying to develop have a career. And then to their earlier conversation, if you want to return to work or not to return to work, create a culture and a society where there aren't any negative biases on either side of that, and women can truly choose what's the best option for them and their families without pressure from society to do one thing or the other. That's a tall order, but that's something that's going to require individuals and organizations and government and everyone to work together to figure out how to solve.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's incredible. And thank you guys so much. I wanted to end off with a quote by Malala. And she said, "To all the young girls who are listening today, do not wait for someone else to come and speak for you. It's you who can change the world." So thank you both. Thank you both so much for your time. I think you and I learned so much, and I hope everyone else does as well.
Alicia, thank you. You are inspiring us and so many. And I think with, young people like yourself, we know that the future is going to be brighter. So you're an inspiration. Thank you for hosting us.
I agree. You are an inspiration. We hope that lots of young women will follow your lead. So thank you so much for all the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Absolutely.